Some of you will be familiar with this story, some of you won't. That's perfectly fine. Also, this is coming on the back of Jesus and his disciples are in another town. They get word from these sisters that his good friend Lazarus is sick, and would he please come? Of course, Jesus is a known healer at the time, and so that's what you do, right? If you know somebody that can do these kind of things, and someone you love is sick, you call the teacher over. He has lingered, he has waited, and Lazarus has died. So he sort of waited too long, you could say, and he's died. This is where the story picks up, okay? On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been laid in a tomb for 4 days. And now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha and Mary, to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. There's already some feelings there. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. And the one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? What a penetrating question. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And after she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. And now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out to him, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, they replied, and Jesus wept. And the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. The Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for that he had been there for 4 days. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe you would see the glory of God? And so they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and he said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. What a story. What a story. So turn to somebody, if you want to make a little triad, or just a person that's next to you. What struck you? What stands out to you in this hearing? This is not just an event, a historical occurrence that demonstrates something about the power or significance of Jesus. It's a story that, when coupled with this it's a foreshadowing story of a greater story, the story of what Jesus would do in his own body. And this story has the power, in a sense, to reshape, to reframe everything that happens to us. Every other story can and should be governed by this one story. 2 years ago, about this time, I think April, I read Rutger Bregman's curious little book called Humankind. In that book, he recounts two stories, one that most of us have heard and one that most of us have not. The story that we know takes place on a deserted island somewhere in the Pacific. A plane has just gone down, and the only survivors are some British schoolboys who can't believe their good fortune. Nothing but beach, shells, and water for miles, and better yet, no grown-ups. On the very first day, the boys instituted democracy of sorts. One boy, Ralph, is elected to be the group's leader. He's athletic, charismatic, and handsome. And his game plan is simple. Ralph has 3 principles for governing the island. 1, have fun. 2, make smoke signals. And 3, survive. Those are Ralph's rules. Number 1 is a success, but the others not so much. The boys are more interested in feasting and frolicking than in tending the fire, for example. And so before long, they've begun painting their faces, casting off their clothes, and they develop overpowering urges to punch, kick, and bite each other. By the time a British naval officer comes ashore, the island is a smoldering wasteland. 3 of the children are dead. In fact, if you know this story, the naval officer says, I should have thought that a pack of British boys would have been able to put up a better show than that. And at this, Ralph bursts into tears. And as the story goes, Ralph wept for the end of innocence. And we read, and for the darkness of man's heart. This story never happened. An English school teacher named William Golding made it up in 1951. His novel, called The Lord of the Flies, would sell tens of millions of copies and be translated into more than 30 languages and hailed as one of the classic novels of the 20th century. You may have had to read it in school, or you were supposed to read it but didn't. It's probably more likely. Well, there you go. I finally told you what it was about. So it's a cynical story about the power of death and self-destruction and the power of the worst parts of our nature. And we all believe it to be true. Now, Bregman, this guy who wrote this book called Humankind, Bregman first read The Lord of the Flies when he was a teenager. And he says, this is what Bregman says, I remember being disillusioned afterwards. But not for a second did I think that to doubt Golding's view of human nature. That didn't happen until years later when I began delving into the author's life. I learned what an unhappy individual he had been. An alcoholic, prone to depression. Actually, Golding, the author of The Lord of the Flies, was quoted as saying, I have always understood the Nazis because I am their sort by nature. This is Golding's own view of himself. And it was partly out of that self-knowledge that he wrote The Lord of the Flies. And so Bregman begins to wonder, had anyone ever really studied what real children would do if they found themselves alone on a deserted island? And so he wrote an article, Bregman, he wrote an article this years ago, he wrote an article about the subject in which he compared The Lord of the Flies to modern scientific insights and concluded that in all probability, kids would not act that way. They might act very differently. Anyway, he got a lot of feedback about that article disagreeing with it. Sort of saying that's not how kids would be, doubling down on the Lord of the Flies story. So on a whim, he stumbled on, this is Bregman's story, on a whim he stumbled on a very long buried story of 6 Tongan boys who were bored with their Catholic boarding school existence and stole a fishing boat with dreams of making it to Fiji in a new life. 6 teenage boys set sail. They weren't great planners, these 6 teenage boys. They brought a couple of bundles of bananas, a few sparse supplies, and no means of navigation. This could be a problem. And they sailed off into the night. Their biggest mistake was falling asleep. They all fell asleep. They would be awoken to a massive storm. And so they tried to lift the sail in the midst of the storm, only to have it shredded, ripped to pieces by the tearing winds. And so for 8 days, they drifted without food or water, on the verge of death. Mad with thirst, on the 8th day, they spotted an island. This island is actually called Ata. This is a true story. And this was no island paradise with waving palm trees and so on. This was a rock jetting 1,000 feet from the sea. But it was a welcome sight for these boys. In fact, no one had lived or inhabited this island. No, there were no people on the island. And no one had lived on it for 100 years. But there, these boys would not just survive, they would thrive for more than a year, some 15 months. The 6 boys, Sione, Stephen, Kolo, David, Luke, and Mano. They set up a small commune with a food garden. They hollowed out tree trunks to store rainwater. They built a gymnasium with curious weights, a badminton court, chicken pens, and a permanent fire, all from handiwork, one old knife blade, and much determination. While the boys in the Lord of the Flies come to blows over the fire, these boys in real life, in their version, tended their flame so it never went out for more than a year, not even for a moment. The kids agreed to work in teams of 2, drawing up strict roster for garden, kitchen, and guard duty, guarding the fire. And sometimes they quarreled, but whenever that happened, they solved it by imposing, they had a system of timeout, which would be, I'd say, easy to do on an island. Just like, you go over there. We just won't talk for a while till we appreciate each other again. Good advice? Good advice? Their days began and ended with song and prayer. Kolo fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires they salvaged from the wrecked boat. And he played it to help lift their spirits, and their spirits needed lifting. Because all summer long, all during the summer that they were there, it hardly rained. And it drove the boys frantic with thirst. And they tried constructing a raft. They were so desperate, they tried constructing a raft in order to leave the island, but it fell apart in the crashing surf. Worst of all, Stephen slipped one day, fell off a cliff, and broke his leg. And the other boys kind of climbed down to him, helped him back to the top, and they set his leg using sticks and leaves. Don't worry, Sione joked. We'll treat you like the king. You get to be the king and we'll do all the work for you. They survived initially on fish, coconuts, tame birds. They drank the blood as well as eating the meat. Seabird eggs, they sucked them dry. And later, when they got to the top of the island, this is really cool. When they finally made it to the top of the island, there was an ancient volcanic crater where people used to live 100 years before. And there inside the crater, they discovered taro, bananas, and chickens. Chickens had been breeding for 100 years. So that was a good day. When you find the leftover chicken colony that's still there. They were finally rescued on Sunday, September 11th, 1966. The local physician who saw them later expressed astonishment at their muscled physiques and Stephen's perfectly healed leg. And they remained best friends for the rest of their lives. But this story, this true story, which is about the power of life over death, we've never heard. Instead, The Lord of the Flies rules what literary scholars call our meta-narrative. It's the story that rises above other stories. It's a story that governs other stories. The truth is, our meta-narrative matters. It matters the way we see the world, the way we see each other, and of course, ultimately, the way we see God. And look, death is always near us. And stories about death sell. They're easier to believe. They're easy to apply to the rest of our lives. Look, all of what we now call reality television is based on the Lord of the Flies meta-narrative. What do? We take random people, put them on some island, some island environment, and watch them go at each other. And this not just for our entertainment, but to confirm what we believe about ourselves and about what it means to be human. This is the story that towers above other stories. And in every iteration of what we have the audacity to call reality TV, we say that's reality. But it isn't. The truth is, Jesus is offering us this morning a different meta-narrative. He's offering us a story here that starts with Lazarus. And the revelation, actually what's behind this story is the revelation that there is a being that somehow has the strength and authority to speak down to death, to order it about. That's the thing, actually, that's most significant about the story. I get why we relate to Mary and Martha, why we understand the struggle of it. But the truth is, the most remarkable thing about this story is that there is a person, there is a being that can tell death what to do. And that's just not something we even know how to frame. What do you do with that piece of information? This is a story about a man called Lazarus, who was a friend of Jesus, who falls ill. And prayers and medicine cannot save him. And he dies. But he was a friend of Jesus. And so the teacher does eventually come. And he weeps at the loss. But somehow he's not confined by the loss. Somehow, impossibly, he vetoes death itself. And what is finally turns out to be something which is temporary. Turns this thing we understand to be permanent to be temporary. And then he says these words, I am the resurrection and the life. He doesn't just do it. He explains who the person is doing it. So that you understand, this is not a one-off event. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is who you're looking at. That, of course, it starts with Lazarus, but it comes to its climax on a Roman cross. As we watch this being who can himself command death, himself succumb to death. Willingly. Incredibly. And then in a plot twist, which doesn't just change the outcomes of this story or his story, but every story for every person who has ever lived before or since, he comes back to life. And all of this, we learn, is meant for us. The whole thing was meant to show us something. The whole thing was meant to change us. The whole thing was meant to create a way for us to come to God. Because he dies, this for me this week, this is just made the whole story make sense to me in a different way. Because he dies for all of us. We understand Jesus dies on the cross for all people. For every sinful person, he dies for us. But because he dies for all of us, for love, for forgiveness, for atonement, for reconciliation, because he dies for all of us, he rises then for all of us. It's a story, but it's true. And I have bet my life that it is true. And if you have too, then it should rise to be the meta-narrative for all of us. The story that governs all stories. The story by which other stories are measured in their truthfulness or helpfulness. And yeah, it's a story about an innocent, wrongfully accused and condemned who overcomes not just that bitter human misery and betrayal and injustice, but death itself. And if it's true, it means so much for our experience of misery and bitterness and failure. It's not just about when you die, but it's about every single time you experience what the psalmist called the shadow of death, which is everywhere. It is the predominant narrative because it's everywhere. A new meta-narrative is possible. And I want to make the argument this morning that the story of Easter is not just a true story that reveals something about Jesus and God and your eternal future. It is that. But it's the kind of story we need to remember and let it sort of find its way into all of our experience. Not just because it's true, but because it has the power to reshape our every other encounter with death, failure, and unforgiveness that we face in this life. Like a barrier has been broken and everything is different now. I was thinking about Roger Bannister. It was commonly believed up until 1954 that a human being could not run a 4-minute mile, that you would explode or something, turn into dust. No one had ever done it, and it was just this barrier. It wasn't just that it was some sort of barrier that hadn't been broken. It was a psychological barrier. There was a belief that it was physically impossible for a human body to pierce that 4-minute mile mark. And of course, Roger Bannister, who was a medical student in Oxford at the time, 25 years old, goes out to a meet. He runs track for Oxford, goes out to a meet in his like ugly leather shoes or whatever, and he did it. He broke this barrier. May 6, 1954. And actually, there's footage of it and he collapses at the end of getting 3 minutes and 59 seconds. And Bannister, in his book called The 4-Minute Mile, in his autobiography called The 4-Minute Mile, she says he thought he had died. He thought, this is it. I broke it, now I'm dead. I killed myself breaking this barrier. But you see, there was this mythos around the 4-minute mile, this belief, this psychological barrier, this story, this greater story that it couldn't be done. And of course, once it's done, it's not just that he had broken the record, it's that he had broken the story. Do you understand? He'd broken the myth about it. And that same year, 2 other runners would break that barrier. That same year, as if something just changed because it could be done. Even just that changed everybody. Everybody who was fast and got close to it thought, well, you don't die. Roger didn't die, so let's go. I'm going to do that kick at the end there for one second off. And now, of course, collegiate athletes almost can do a 4-minute mile. It's like child's play. And that's not. I can do a 10-minute mile. That's my. Because it wasn't just a barrier. It was a story. And it's in our natures to pass on our stories, because our stories are the way we pass on who we are. They're the way we pass on good qualities and our bad qualities. You understand genetics, right? You understand that we pass on who we are to our prodigy, to our offspring. And that's biological, but it's also metaphorical. Like all the people within the circle of your influence, you pass on things about who you are. To illustrate this, I thought I would tell you about myself for a second. I have let's not call it a defect, let's call it a cool feature. one of my eyes is slightly smaller than the other. So if you really take a good look, this eye, I think. So it's just for some reason it's just closed. I'm assuming my eyeballs are the same size, but this eye just likes to stay slightly closed, more closed. So I have to be conscious. It's particularly bad when you take a picture of me because you probably don't know. Maybe you do. Don't tell me. But you don't notice it until you take a picture. Like, why is one of his eyes closed and the other one's not? So I try to adjust. Like I try to open this one and close this one, find an equilibrium somehow. Anyway, the family. There's a story around it. The family call it Tiny Eye. It's a dad has tiny eye, and sometimes it just appears in a picture. It's a picture of me with tiny eye. This eye always wants to close. But it's a feature, not a bug. It's a good thing about me. It makes me unique or different, or does it? So I pass it on. So Skylar is the best example of tiny eye. In fact, there's a classic picture. There's a sort of classic Skylar picture where we're in a grocery store, and Sherry's going to show you this picture. This is. And of course, when we took this picture, you're like, does he have conjunctivitis or something? Or no, that's just tiny eye. It just occurs. Every time you take a picture, one eye shuts even more. So there it is. I mean, I have this feature. I pass it on to, my kids. One of my kids. Do others guys have it? No? You have a lesser tiny eye? Well, anyway, shock of all shocks. I have grandkids. I have 2 grandkids. Kiro, the firstborn grandson, goes for school pictures, Cambridge Christian School. This is his school picture. So we have these qualities, these features which you pass on to each other. But the important thing is not just that we pass on who we are to each other, but we memorialize it in story. And somehow the tiny eye is a thing in our family. It's something maybe even to celebrate. Like, cool, check you out. You got tiny eye. That's so cool. So I don't know how this happens because Levi, the smallest grandson, who's, I don't know, we still counting him in months, I presume. He's less than 2 years old, right? I don't, anyway, it's too many people to keep up with their, anyway, he's young. He's a little guy, and he comes here, and I think he's in kids' church one Sunday. He comes out of kids' church, and they have done a little arts and crafts thing where they've made like a bee. I presume it's a bee, although the one he had didn't have any wings or anything like that, but it was like a bee body that he had made. And this is Levi trying to do crafts, a little 18-month-old kid. This is what he made. What? It should be my profile. It's the similarities are striking. You see his little name there, Levi? This is my point. Tiny eye, it goes from not just a genetic feature that somehow passed on to each other. It becomes a story that we tell. Because a part of how we understand each other and what it means to, be in our family somehow. And this is what I mean. Sky has it, Kiro has it, but we all have the story of it. You see, we all memorialize these things in story. Here's the thing. Passing on the tiny eye is not the important thing. It's the story that goes with it that matters. Now, it could be something that we all feel deeply ashamed and embarrassed about that we try to cover. But of course, our story can be a story of like laughter and levity and maybe even being proud of your tiny eye to some degree. And that's fine. But the truth is the story matters and how you understand yourself and the things we pass on to each other. It's not just the condition, but it's the story about the condition that matters. I mean, this is like a banal example I'm giving you about the tiny eye. Of course, we face much greater, much more dire conditions than that. But this makes the stories we tell in those dire conditions even that much more important. The truth is, death is all around us. We live in what the psalmist called the valley of the shadow of death. the things we most cherish die. Let's talk about that for a minute. Let's have the courage to just go there emotionally for a moment. As I thought about this, I thought of three big deaths we encounter in our lives. One, dreams die. Our dreams die. Two, our relationships die. And three, the people that we love, including ourselves, also die. And the meta-narrative of death around those experiences is certainly alive and winning. Let's take those one at a time. Dreams die. Something you wanted to do or to become, a vision you had for yourself, for your marriage, for your home, for your children, a goal you set for your career, for your finances, for your leadership, for your influence. Maybe it's not even something you stated or you were conscious about. You know, we actually hold secret dreams, human beings, in our hearts that are not really even fully known to us until they're dashed, until those dreams are dashed. The dream of a happy home, for example, is known most poignantly when the home is falling apart. The dream of a promotion is known when you're 10 years there and you realize everyone's being promoted but me. You didn't think it mattered to you, but you realize it does. The dream of completion left incomplete. The dreams of community left in pieces. The dreams of achievement left in mediocrity. The dreams of personal peace and security left in the chaos of deepened anxiety and insecurity. Most of you know that, one of my kids is really struggles and is wayward and lives at death's door, actually. And I can tell you that it's not just that we struggle with the fear and anxiety that comes along with somebody that lives such a risky life, and the estrangement that we feel towards her, but it's actually, there's a grieving of a dead dream, you see, where you wanted something for your child and you saw it in your mind's eye, and even though you knew it was not something that you could fully control, it's something you believed and hoped would happen for that person. No one looks at their little toddler and thinks you're going to grow up to not become anything. We don't. We see possibility and potential. We're prone to dreams. We're hopeful people, actually, by nature. We look at a child and we think they're going to be something great one day. And if we're decent parents, we whisper that in their ear. You will be someone someday. But we all don't become someone. Some of us drastically destroy our own lives. There are perils all around us. Some of which happen to us, some of which we do to ourselves. But dreams are funny things. They flatter to deceive as we keep coming back to them, no matter how often they falter. We're stubborn dreamers, people. Until finally, we're just so jaded and cynical and full of apathy towards hopes and dreams, our own and others. But even then, even the most cynical people in this room, I bet you, give me enough time with you, that you'll see that those dreams still linger. They're there. And they should be. Because deep down in the place created by God and in the image of God, we know that He makes His best creations from the dust of the earth. That He is, as revealed by Jesus here, most glorified and most revealed and most committed to us when He takes something dead and He brings it back to life. Yes, dreams die, but they come back to life too. And we know that because of Lazarus, because of Jesus, and because of Easter. Because our meta-narrative is about this story. Think of these elements of the story we read. The teacher is here. Too late to keep it from dying, though. Right on time to show you the glory of God. Asking, where have you laid this dead dream? And coming to that place with you, He cries too. He loves us in the valley of death and dashed dreams. And then he commands us to take away the stone. And he whispers a word to the dead dream. A word in the Creator's voice, in a language somehow familiar to the natural world, because it was the same voice speaking the same language who once said to the nothing, "Let there be light," and there was light. And this dead thing must obey. Come out, he says. And it does. And all that is left for us to do is take off the grave clothes and let the dream go on living. Changed, but alive again. And relationships die, don't they? I'm sure if you give yourself a moment, you can think of a poignant example in your own life, a deeply painful, lost relationship. We all have estranged family members, best friends that don't talk anymore. We break up and are broken up. We cancel and are canceled. We betray and are betrayed. We promise and we go back on those promises. We are masters of chaos and disorder in relationship. Relationships we never thought would ever fail. And our faith in relationships themselves begins one inexplicable breakdown after another to disappear. Yes, relationships die, but they come back to life too. And we know that because of Lazarus and because of Jesus and because of Easter. And because this is our meta-narrative. The teacher is here. Too late to keep that relationship from dying, but right in time to show you the glory of God. Asking, where have you laid this dead relationship? And coming to that place, Jesus cries too. He loves us in the valley of death and broken promises and betrayal. And he commands us to take away the stone. You know, there's always a stone, by the way, separating us from things that have died. We always put that barrier there. And he whispers a word, and the dead relationship, a word in the Creator's voice, come out. And come out it does. And all that is left for us is to take off the grave clothes and let the relationship go on living, changed, but alive. And of course, and this is the last thing really I'll say this morning, I think, of course, people die too, don't we? You're going to die. There's a thought. But we can live again. I mean, this is the most incredible application of the story, actually. The reason why the story applies to all iterations of death is because it applies to actual death. Do you understand that? It has to apply to real death, brain death, body death, whatever, for it to make any difference as a meta-narrative for all other things. And so it does. I saw in my mind's eye, the iconic picture of Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston, as Sonny Liston is sort of prone on the canvas, flattened. And that camera angle, if you remember this picture, that camera angle kind of pointing up towards Ali, looking up at him, and his arm flexing upward, muscles tense, mouth open in a shout of triumph. This is how I see Jesus standing over the great enemy of humankind. This is how I see Jesus triumphed over death. Knocked out. Death in all forms. How then do we share in that victory? How do we make that story our story? Because there is a part we play. The other thing that struck me this week reading this story is that he keeps asking them to do stuff. Like, he's obviously the main actor, but he keeps having them do stuff. Show me where he is. And they have to take him somewhere. Take the stone away. They have something they have to do. Take off his grave clothes. It's a strange collaboration, this resurrecting somebody, between the supernatural one that talks to God and can say to a dead body, hey, Lazarus, remember me? You hear this voice, come out. And everybody doing their bit. And in some ways, these are all metaphors of the real work that we do in this relationship, which is faith. It's metaphors for believing. This is what we do. This is the part we play, and the whole thing, the whole drama is to simply believe. Jesus saying this incredible line, this world-changing line. I am the resurrection and the life. And the one who believes in me will never die. They will live even though they die. And then to ask Martha, do you believe this? It's not just that it's true. That's not what matters more. What matters is whether or not you will lay hold of that, will apprehend that, will make that matter for you through faith, by believing. The only question that matters this morning for you and for me is, do we believe it? Do I believe that or not? That's how you access that incredible power and victory, which is already yours in Christ Jesus. Do you believe this? If you do, then you will live even though you die. I don't know, Emily, maybe I'll invite you up to sort of begin to close here. Take a second in your own heart and mind. This is a story that you either believe or you don't believe. It's a story that you think is either true and applies to all of life or it doesn't. And some of you do believe and have believed and need to believe again. You need to let this become the meta-narrative for your life. Some of you have never really laid hold of this story for yourself, never really applied your own faith to it. And listen, I say this with love. I know that one day you will grow sick. And those who love you will pray that you recover. And the teacher will come too late, and you will die. It'll come too late to keep you from dying, but it'll come right on time to show you the glory of God. Asking where they have laid you, he will come to that place and weep with those who mourn for your passing. And he will comfort them, and he will love those that you have loved in their time of sadness at your loss. And there, in the valley of death, he will come to you, and he will speak to you, and he will call you by your name. And he will command forces I do not comprehend to take away the stone. And he will whisper a word in the ear of the Father about you. Something like, this one is with me. And he'll say to you in the Savior's voice, a voice you have come to know so well, come out. And though death has taken you, he will take your hand and take you from death. And out you will come. And even though you have died, you will live, changed, perfected, but alive again, in a way that only angels understand. I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe that this morning? And guys, if you will lay hold of that story, that narrative by faith, the things in your life which are impossible, which appear impossible, will become possible. In the valley of the shadow of death, we will learn to hear and tell a different story. This good story is meant to be our story. but the part we play is faith. Will you believe in him this morning again? Will you put your faith in him? Will you trust him? And listen, I know with some of you this morning, this is your story. You believe, you have believed. And I'm just saying, my word to you this morning, Christian person, is own it. Like, let it seep into your core. Let it lead you. Let it lead your heart away from cynicism, away from fear, away from despair, away from hopelessness. Let it lead you to know that whatever has died in your life can live again in a world ruled by Jesus. And for those that, it's been a while since you felt that kind of faith and you feel far actually from God. You sense that it might be true, but you aren't sure how to access it. Guys, I can tell you all it is. Grace, the grace of God. All the work was done by him, and the grace of God is accessed only by believing. All you have to do this morning is pray in the quietude of your own heart, a sincere prayer. A commitment you make to say, I believe in you. I will trust you with my life. I will follow you. So for both groups of people, today we will seal that act of faith and belief as we come to the table. And I don't have them, but the elements of communion will be a sort of tangible way that we take a step. You're going to stand up if you want to, if you feel led, you'll come forward and you'll take a piece of bread, put it in the wine, the juice, and that combination, that gift, will represent the laying hold by faith of this great story, which is meant to be yours. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and after he gave thanks, he broke that bread. And he said, This is my body, which is broken for you. Take it and eat it to remember me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, and he said, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for the forgiveness of sin. Drink it, all of you, every time you gather to remember me. And when you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. This is our sacred moment. This is our sacred right to take hold of the body and blood of Jesus, to take it into ourselves. And all that he did, not just for Lazarus, but for all of us, for all of humankind, becomes ours in the taking.